Good morning. Welcome to our Thursday lecture on applications of data science to software engineering. So it's a fourth lecture today, and we have arrived at a topic which is close to my heart, a topic of talking to people, talking to software developers, and more specifically, conducting interviews. So we are still in the data collection part of the course. So we are trying to collect as much data as possible and as much relevant data as possible from different sources which can be available to us. And in this particular case, talking to people. So from the perspective of research strategies, interviews are commonly associated with field studies, judgment studies, and sample studies. Indeed, when we are trying to conduct a judgment study, we want to find what our experts think about the topics we are interested in. And of course, the same holds for a sample study where we are not interviewing experts, but interviewing representatives of the population. Of course, this merely represents typical methods. It does not mean that other kinds of research strategies cannot benefit from interviews. In fact, you might remember the fMRI study, which is, of course, a controlled experiment or a laboratory experiment. But you might also remember that as part of this experiment, the researchers have interviewed participants. So essentially, in this way, or a pretty similar way, interviews can be combined with many other strategies. So why do we actually want to talk to people? So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show you two snippets from two research papers. And I would like to ask you to read those fragments and try to see what is common between them. In a way, they have a common goal. So please read those texts. Please try to identify this common goal and type it in the chat. So what is common to two fragments? Okay, so Yasona says that both have been conducted at companies, which is yes, but it's not the part which is most relevant here. Indeed. Okay, so let's see what Rikyan thinks and Stera. We are studying empirically how the software engineering processes operate based on direct viewpoints of employees, the impact of software both onto the engineers and specific subjects. Okay, so all those answers are correct, but they are not exactly what I had in mind. So I should be phrasing this question better next time. So what is common here is that essentially both studies are exploratory in nature, right? So they are starting with, so the first fragment talks about broad survey. The second fragment talks about the first stage. So they are trying to charter the unknown territory. So interviews can be used to get a first global picture of the phenomenon we would like to study. If you don't know anything, or if you don't know enough about what we want to study, it is usually a good idea to talk to people because they can tell us more than, for instance, artifacts. But of course, exploratory context is not the only context where interviews play a role. So here we see yet another collection of snippets from the scientific papers. And you see that I have highlighted works like understand and explain. So in the first fragment, the authors have performed an observation of a code base in a company, and then they wanted to understand what are the reasons for this observation. In the second fragment, again, the authors have observed developers using a static analysis tool, but of course, purely by observing, we cannot know why behavior, what is behind the behavior which is being observed, and this is why the researchers wanted participants to explain them what was going on. The very same thing happens with the last paper where students have been studied, and the authors want to understand, to explain the effect they have observed. So this is an explanatory scenario. So essentially interviews can be used both to explore a new phenomenon and to explain the observations made so far. So now it's up to you. So I have here a small quote from a scientific paper by Jan Ole Hansen and his co-authors. And what I would like to ask you is whether it is exploratory or explanatory. And I'm going to start a poll now. Okay, we are almost ready. So 9 participants thought that it was an exploratory study and 6 that it was an explanatory study. So let us read it again. Let us read it together. So we conducted an interview with 24 practitioners from 17 companies during 20 interviews. Following a semi-structured approach, we asked for their definition of continuous software engineering, most relevant elements for continuous software engineering, their experience and plans for further additions to their continuous software engineering processes. So in this case, there are no references to previous observations. There's also no indication that the researchers want to understand why those observations have been taken place. So what we can now see here is that researchers are trying to understand a new phenomenon, right? They're asking for definitions. And this is a typical element for an exploratory use of a scientific method in general, and in this particular case for exploratory interviews. So the correct answer is A. So let us move to the question of how to conduct an interview. So this is a simplified model of the interview process proposed by Eric Strandberg. As you see, the interview process is much more than the interview itself, which is step D. It starts with planning and all kinds of pre-interview discussions within the research team and eventually with stakeholders. And then it essentially ends with the publication and creation of the interview data. Of course, each and every step has sub-steps. And of course, nowadays, most of the interviews are conducting using video conferencing software, meaning that in addition to the audio files, we usually have video recordings. But most of the elements are still on the slide. So we start with careful planning, with conducting an interview, with recording this interview, with typically transcribing this interview, analyzing this transcript, archiving, and so on and so on and so on. So in the spirit of separating data analysis and data collection and data analysis parts in this course, we are going to focus on the left hand of the slide. So analysis of transcripts is pretty much similar to analysis of text in general, and we are going to have a guest lecture later on during the course on qualitative methods in software engineering research. So when you are thinking about interviews, of course, there is a whole bunch of aspects we need to keep in mind. For instance, what do we want to ask? Or whom do we want to interview? Or who will interview? Where will the interviews be conducted? And how will the interview data be stored? Or finally, what can go wrong before, during, or after the interview? But of course, when we are talking about the interviews, we primarily think about the interview questions. So what do we want to ask? So when it comes to interviews, depending on what kind of questions we want to ask, interviews can be classified as structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. So let us start with the structured kind of interviews. Structured interviews have a very, very specific goal in mind, and the person interviewing is essentially asking the questions exactly as they are written, and there are no deviations possible. An example of a structured interview would be a person going to a company and essentially asking a series of questions as they have been predefined, yes, no, and so on. The questions are indeed typically quantitative. Yes, no, how many, high, medium, low, and so on and so on. Of course, those quantitative questions are very amenable for statistical analysis and for visualization. Analyzing this kind of data is usually easier than analyzing results of open questions. However, structured interviews are pretty much uncommon, simply because if our questions are asked exactly as written, and they are usually quantitative, then a survey is a more appropriate instrument. So next, when we are going to talk about surveys, we are going to see that with surveys, we can usually reach much larger populations with interviews. I mean, think about the fact that a typical interview takes an hour of your time, plus you need a certain amount of time to transcribe the interview, sometimes up to 10 times the duration of the interview, to analyze the data and so on. So this puts some kind of natural boundary on how many interviews you can conduct. For surveys, this is of course not the case. So a much more common way of, a more common way of conducting interviews is unstructured method, but it is still quite uncommon because it's very costly. So what is an unstructured interview? An unstructured interview is essentially a conversation. So you start with a broadly defined topic. So you don't have a goal, but you have a topic. And in the extreme case, there are essentially no questions at all. So you do not want to ask any specific questions, because the moment you are asking questions, you might be biasing your interviewee. The topic is known, and essentially the interviewee is talking about the topic in the way they like, and in the way they as much and as little as they like. This is, of course, really, really hard to analyze. And it's also absolutely not guaranteeing that the information you are going to get in this way will be anyhow related to research questions that researchers actually want to get answered. So a less extreme way of conducting unstructured interviews would involve many open questions. Analysis is indeed a textual analysis, and all this makes it extremely complex. So this is why, in practice, we mostly conduct semi-structured interviews, and that's why I'm also putting a coral here, which is, of course, a living thing, but it also has a very clear structure. So a semi-structured interview will typically have a broad enough goal. So it has a goal as opposed to an unstructured interview, but the goal is broad enough. Questions are asked as written, similarly to a structured interview, but more questions can be asked if needed. For example, if an unexpected answers come up, or if you observe that the interviewer contradicts themselves, or if you have observed that interviewee A has said something which contradicts what interviewee B has said before. So in a semi-structured interview, it typically will be mixed closed and open questions. And then analysis techniques will typically depend on the structure of questions. For closed questions, we will be able to perform statistical analysis. For open questions, we'll be able to perform textual analysis. And indeed, semi-structured interviews are the most common type in empirical software engineering. Just to give you examples of what kind of questions people ask, how many years have you been programming? This is a question which can be perfectly asked in a structured interview or even in a survey. But for instance, what do you see as the biggest problem in maintaining programs is, of course, a much more open question. And this is a typical question for a semi-structured interview. Again, the first question could have also been asked in a semi-structured interview, but the last question cannot be asked in a structured interview. So you see here multiple questions we can ask, but of course, how do we know what questions do we really want to ask? So, of course, this discussion about questions is not relevant if your goal is to conduct an unstructured interview, but most of the time we are conducting semi-structured interviews. So, of course, interview questions should depend on research questions we want to get answered. So somehow those interview questions should be derived from research questions. So this is where magic happens, right? So how does it work? So first of all, you need to study the lingo. You need to study the lingo of the company or of the project you are going to be working with, because they typically use terms you don't necessarily know. So just to give you an example, recently we have conducted a study on how logs are used in a large company in Eindhoven region. Log files, right? So intuitively, of course, we could have just asked people, how do you use logs? However, in this company, are 4 different types of files recording execution-related data, and only one of those types is actually called execution logs. Other types are known as functional traces, throughput traces, and functional data. So if we would have only asked about logs, we would only got partial answers. I see a question, what is the lingo? So lingo is some kind of sub-language, some kind of jargon which is being used in a specific community or in a specific project. So for instance, in this company, when they are talking about logs, they're thinking about only one type, one specific type of those files recording execution-related data. So it's important to understand, to formulate our questions such that they will not be ambiguous or misleading for people we want to talk to. Once we have learned how do they call their things and have achieved certain understanding that we have a shared language, we can start drafting the questions. And of course, each question has to be motivated. I mean, if there is no motivation, there is no need to ask a question. And this motivation can come from a research question, or from a hypothesis, or from previous literature. So for instance, if let's say we want to study how developers read code, and we know from the literature that more experienced and less experienced developers read code in different ways. So we can ask questions about experience. Or let's say we want to understand how developers read execution logs. Again, we know from previous literature that experience influences how developers read code, but not necessarily how they read logs. Still, we can conjecture that experience might also affect the ways developers read logs. And again, this is a justification, this is a motivation to ask about interviewees' experience as part of the interview. Typical questions can be seen as descriptions or explanations, like how do you explain something or can you describe something? Usually interviews become interesting when interviewees can provide us with specific examples, right? Can you give an example when your pull request was unfairly evaluated, for instance? And we can always ask people to reflect on their practices. So the question was, what was most challenging for you as a developer in this project, or what you typically do when you are maintaining files, and so on. So those questions will be typically providing rich information and can be recommended. What questions to avoid are the double-barreled questions. So essentially those questions which are combining two elements, like is this tool interesting and useful? So how are you supposed to answer this question if you, for instance, think that it is only interesting but not useful, or only useful but not interesting? And we need to avoid leading questions. I could not find an easy example of a leading question in software engineering research, of course, because everybody tries to avoid them. But this is an example from the general context. Like, how fast would you estimate Mr. Smith's car was traveling over the speed limit when he lost control of his vehicle and slammed into the victim's car? So this is very clearly indicating the opinion of the person who is asking this question about Mr. Smith's behavior, and so on and so on. So this should not be, this kind of question should not be asked, because the general attitude of the interviewer should be quite humble. You should not be forcing by any means your own opinions on the interviewees. And finally, let me just remind you, you should not be asking irrelevant questions. There is nothing wrong with collecting data about all kinds of personal things, including, for instance, gender, ethnicity, age, and so on. But there should be a reason to ask about those things. If there is no reason to ask about those things, do not ask. This is also known as the data minimization principle. So after quite some suffering, we have created those questions, and then we are going to review and revise phase. So the process of creating questions, the process of polishing questions, is usually iterative. So during this process, you, together with your co-authors or with your supervisor, are going to look at those questions and try to check whether the respondents will be able to understand them in an unambiguous way, whether they will understand the relevance of your questions, and of course, whether those questions are not going to make the interviewee uncomfortable in any way. So again, if there is no good reason to ask the question, do not ask. However, this is still not the end of the story, because so far, only researchers have been involved in this process. And whatever we might, as researchers, might think to be unambiguous is not necessarily the case for our prospective interviewees. This is why it is crucial to perform piloting. So we need essentially to contact one of the members of the target audience, so developers, and show them our questions and try to conduct a trial interview to check whether the questions are clear, to check how much time does this trial interview take, to check whether we are getting the information we are hoping for. But we need also to remember that information obtained through this kind of pilot interview cannot be used for the actual study. And the reason is because typically the outcome of the pilot interview is a change to the questions. So once we have modified our questions, we cannot really say that the results of the pilot interview are comparable to the results of the actual interviews. So this is why the results of the pilot interviews cannot be used as part of the study. But this is also the reason why we don't go directly to the piloting stage and first of all review and revise the questions ourselves within the research team. Because of course we want to reduce the number of people we should involve to pilot the questions. Okay, so let's continue. Here is our question again. So here we have Alice and Bob, and Alice and Bob conduct an interview study, and they found interesting that the company they are studying has a very diverse workplace. So in order to capture their data, they extend the instrument, so they extend the list of interview questions to include questions on ethnicity, political and religious affiliation, sexual orientation, and membership in trade unions. So a very simple question for you: is this a good idea, A, or is it a bad idea, B? Okay, so I see that 9 respondents think that it's a bad idea, and 3 respondents see that it's a good idea. It's actually a bad idea. And why is this a bad idea? Not because they are not allowed to ask questions about ethnicity, political and religious affiliation, and so on, but because this is not related to their research goal. So they merely found this to be interesting. There is no actual deep reason for them to ask questions about all those aspects of their interviewees. If they really want to study ethnicity, political and religious affiliation, and so on, they need to include it in their research design, and of course, think on what do they really want to know. So merely asking questions, and in particular, very personal questions, purely out of curiosity, is not a good idea. Of course, an interview, as I already said before, is more than interview questions alone. So far we have finished preparing an interview guide, we have even reviewed them, and we have even piloted them. But still, interviews have to be prepared very carefully, and it's not only about questions. Keep in mind that each interview is very valuable, and we cannot just redo an interview simply because we cannot ask the same questions to the same person twice. So ideally, everything should be right on spot from the beginning, or at least as much as possible on spot from the beginning. So how many people do you want to interview? So a common number in software engineering studies is roughly 25, 35 studies participants. But of course, it's not only about number. So on Tuesday, we talked about sampling, and there are all kinds of sampling strategies we discussed. So many things will essentially depend on how do we recruit people, how do we perform sampling of our interviewees. So for instance, if we are doing a quota sampling, then what's important in quota sampling is that all substrata are adequately represented. So if I'm interested in hearing voices of people of different genders, then of course we need to interview women, of course we need to interview men, and of course we need to interview non-binary people. So this is something that we need to keep in mind when determining the number of people we want to interview. Obviously, more substrata we identify in our target audience, more people we need to interview. Why wouldn't we interview just as many people as we can? Like, why wouldn't we interview hundreds of people? So there are two issues here. So first of all, there is a feasibility limitation because, as I said, interviewing people takes time. And I cannot interview 100 people on my own in 1 month's time. At the same time, we are creating a burden on the interviewees. Don't forget that you are not the only person interviewing them. Usually people are getting tired of participating in scientific studies, in particular if they don't see an immediate value of those studies. If people are getting reluctant to participate, then essentially your number of interviewees will drop down. So to avoid this from happening in the future, to prevent this from happening in the future, we don't need to ask too many people. Typically, and so instead of determining a number of people we want to review in advance, we can interleave this decision making of whether we need to continue with interviews or not as we go. So how would it work? So we will start with recruiting an interviewee in some way, and recall our previous lecture about sampling on how to do this. Then we conduct an interview, we analyze what the interviewee has said, and we compare the results of this analysis with the insights we have obtained from the previous interviews. If there are no new insights, we can stop, we can claim that saturation has been reached. If there are still new insights, then we just recruit another interviewee. So this is an iterative process which would require us to analyze the interviews as we go, right? Of course, we need to be careful. If the sampling strategy is not adequate, then the saturation can be reached too early, which would lead to wrong conclusions. For example, If I would like to study quality of our educational programs, but I'm only recruiting interviewees from computer science and engineering, then I would be reaching saturation relatively fast, probably, but I would have completely missed the opinions of students of embedded systems, data science, and security. So it is important to support the saturation argument by the diversity argument. So we need to ensure that our interviewees are coming from as many different subgroups as possible to ensure that they have as diverse as possible experiences and opinions. So whom do we want to interview? Of course, once we have identified how many people we want to interview or how do we organize the interviewing process, we need to decide how to select people for the interview. And this is essentially becoming a sampling question. And we have already talked about sampling during the previous lecture. So again, if you have, for instance, a good sampling frame, just to remind you, it's a list of all people we potentially might be interviewing. For instance, a list of all people working in a company, a list of all students following any educational program. We can perform random sampling. We can also try to combine it with some kind of stratification arguments. For instance, performing stratified random sampling or quota sampling if we are interested in hearing voices of people from different subgroups. Alternatively, if you do not have a sampling frame or if you are conducting an exploratory study, we can be using a convenience sampling just to interview, for instance, people who are in our own social network, or a purposive sampling. For instance, we can try to interview people who are who have been involved in a large open source project for at least 5 years and have been contributing at least regularly for at least 3/4 of the time, something like this. This would be a purposive sampling, right? But of course, people have their own agency. So which means that if we selected a person for an interview, we cannot just interview them. We need to have their consent. And this consent is not merely yes, yes, just ask me questions, but it's a formal document. And this formal document is signed by the interviewee. This is why it is called an informed consent. So the person should be able to know what they are getting themselves into. So we should be able to provide our participants as much information as might be needed to make an informed decision about whether or not they wish to participate in a study. Some studies involve deception, so essentially not telling the complete truth to the interviewees or to study participants. This can be justified, but we need to be extremely careful with it. In any case, typical things that are included in such an informed consent form are on the slide. I'm going to show you an example of such a form in a moment. So risks and benefits. So interviewees should know what are the risks and benefits. So benefits for them are not necessarily coming from the interview itself, but they can be coming from the study as a whole. So for instance, if you want to interview people, they might be interested in how is their company performing compared to other companies. So you might be providing them at the end of your study some kind of comparative analysis of companies. Risks, you might be asking people to recall some kind of unpleasant experiences. You might remember one of the interview questions on one of the previous slides was, can you recall a situation when your pull request has been treated unfairly? This is essentially, this may be or might have been a painful experience. So recalling this pain might be risky for your participants. What happens with data? Who is going to have access to this? What happens if an unauthorized person gets access to this? who has access under normal circumstances, right? What happens with withdrawal? Can an interviewee just stop whenever they want, halfway through the interview? Are we going to pay the participants? So usually interviewees are not being compensated in software engineering, but of course participants of most strenuous tasks, such as an fMRI study, actually have been paid. What are the experimental procedures? And finally, maybe one of the most important questions, why have they been selected? So developers typically want to know, why do we want to talk to them rather than to anybody else? And this can, of course, depend on, and should, of course, depend on the research questions you have in mind. Again, there might be situations when you do not want to disclose the actual reason why they've been selected, but you still need to provide a plausible reason why they need to be selected, why they have been selected. So just to show you an example of such an informed consent form, this is an example coming from the University of Victoria in Canada. And it's about a survey, not about an interview, but the basic elements, the basic principles still apply. So if you read it, you see that it starts by identifying the researchers. If you are talking to people, they need to know who you are, because otherwise you know who they are, but they don't know you. Then there is a description of participants. So we are looking for adults 19 years of age or older who regularly interact with bots in their software development activities. So this would be an indication why this particular person has been selected for a study. Then there is a description of the procedure. In this case, it's a short 2-minute survey. Alternatively, it might be an interview, and that will, for instance, take 1 hour, and that will be recorded. Another issue is, of course, confidentiality. So it's usually extremely important to ensure that the answers are treated confidentially. Otherwise, we cannot expect our interviewees to trust us, and this will affect how much they would be likely to disclose. Participation is voluntary, and participants can withdraw at any time without any negative consequences. This is again a crucial point. If participant does not feel comfortable, they should be able to withdraw. And again, risks and benefits. Anonymity. So if you are going to publish a paper based on an interview data, how are we going to refer to you? There are different ways of doing it. We are going to talk about it in the second hour. And again, what is going to happen with data? So why do we actually bother about those consent forms? There are 2 reasons. First of all, it is an ethical imperative. So we cannot do things to people against their will and without them explicitly agreeing to this, right? It's at least some kind of general understanding of how we are supposed to behave. But in fact, it's not only an ethical imperative, but also a legal requirement of the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, or in Dutch, Algemene Verordening Gegevensbescherming, AVG. So this is a European legal framework. And while I'm not a lawyer and I'm not going to provide you legal advice, we are going to start the second hour with briefly discussing when are we allowed to collect data according to the GDPR regulation, and what does it mean for our interview studies. So I will stop here and we will resume our lecture after a break. Okay, it's good to see you again. Let us start. So during the first hour, we have talked about how to interview people. We have discussed what kind of questions to ask. And we have also talked about the idea of informed consent, and that informed consent is not only an ethical imperative, but also a legal requirement of the General Data Protection Regulations, or also known as GDPR. So according to GDPR, there are 6 lawful bases for data collection. Consent is one of them. So consent means that the individual has given clear consent for you to process their personal data for a specific purpose. Keep in mind that while software engineering researchers might think about software engineering data as not being personal, it actually is. Things like project names or company names in combination with demographics of the interviewee might make them identifiable. So lots and lots of things we are talking about are actually personal data. This is also what we have discussed so far, this idea of informed consent. So in a way, informed consent is the easiest requirement to satisfy in case of an interview. However, please keep in mind that consent is given for a specific purpose. So unless you have made a special agreement in this consent form, a special statements in this consent form, reusing interview data might be difficult. Moreover, consent can be withdrawn at any moment, meaning during the interview, after the interview, before the publication, and so on and so on. So consent is indeed the typical argument we are using when we are conducting interviews or actually survey studies. So the next form of a lawful base for data collection according to GDPR is a contract. So the processing is necessary for a contract you have as an individual, or because they have asked you to take specific steps before entering into a contract. So usually we do not use contract as a base for data collection, unless, of course, we can interview people with whom we already have a contract. For instance, if I would like to conduct a study of software developers employed by Eindhoven University of Technology, I might use this kind of argument as a lawful base for data collection, because people who are employed by Eindhoven University of Technology have a form of contract or a form of legal legal context which essentially governs their employment. But most of the times we do not really use it. Legal obligation, so the processing is necessary for you to comply with the law, which is not about contracts. So this is not applicable to us because, of course, there is no court case which would essentially force us to conduct interviews, whether we are talking about code review practices or morals within the organization. Vital interest means that the processing is necessary to protect someone's life. So this is, of course, applicable in the medical context, but we usually do not really conduct this kind of research, or at least I am not aware of any kind of empirical software engineering research which with applications that would fit in this description. So vital interest means that this protecting of lives should happen here and now, which is usually not the case for us. Public task, right? So public task is an interesting category. As the processing is necessary for you to perform a task in the public interest or for official functions, and the task or function has a clear basis in law, right? So we cannot be using it for illegal activities. So this argument in general can be used because, of course, conducting research or educational activities is part of the public task of universities, and those tasks are actually described by law. So this is an example of an argument we typically will put forward when informed consent cannot be obtained. So for instance, if you want to study publicly available data on GitHub or on Stack Overflow, this is the argument we can put forward. this is a public task. We want to conduct research. Conducting research is what we are supposed to be doing by law. So this is a public task of our organization. Be careful, though. This argument of public task has its limitations. According to GDPR, the processing must be necessary. So, for example, if we need to process data of students in order to provide them educational services. It is much less clear-cut whether analyzing data from public repositories such as GitHub or Stack Overflow is strictly speaking necessary. Even more so, if one reasonably can perform the task in a less intrusive way, this lawful basis does not apply. This means that if consent can be obtained, it must be obtained. So if we have a way of obtaining consent of our participants, we should do it. And the final category is a legitimate interest. The legitimate interest means that the processing is necessary for legitimate interest of ours or of a third party, unless there is a good reason to protect the individual's personal data, which would override those legitimate interests. So this is a tricky one. One could say that, for instance, collecting information about Stack Overflow questions or about contributors to GitHub is part of a legitimate interest. However, GDPR has conveniently excluded public authorities from the category of legitimate interest. So since I'm employed by a public institution, I cannot make use of this legitimate interest argument. However, my peers who are working in research institutions or research divisions of companies might be benefit from this. So this was a very brief introduction to GDPR and more specifically to 6 lawful bases for collecting data. On the slide, you see a very small story about an individual who gives their phone number to the website of an attorney. And then the question to you, what lawful basis does an attorney have to use that phone number and contact the individual? Is it a consent? Is it a contract? Is it a legal obligation? Or is it a public task? And I'm going to start the poll now. So what do we see? Most of you think that it's a consent, so 9. One person thinks it's a contract. Nobody thinks it's a legal obligation, and 2 people think it's a public task. So, first of all, this is not a legal obligation, indeed, because there is no legal requirement for an attorney to contact their prospective customers. Unfortunately, this is also not a consent, because there is no indication that this website has provided any kind of estimation of risks and benefits, any kind of description of how the data is going to be processed. So there's just not enough information in this very short description to assume that somebody would be able to provide an informed consent. This is not a public task simply because it's not necessarily a public institution, right? An attorney is a essentially it's an, it's like a company in a certain way. It is actually a contract, because the legal base which we know as a contract also covers situations when someone has asked you to take specific steps before entering a formal contract. So contract is not only things which are governed by a contract, but also things which are leading to creation of such a contract. So to summarize, GDPR is much more than those 6 lawful bases. If you are interested, you can click on the link on the slide or any other document in your favorite language about GDPR. I am not a lawyer, and this entire discussion is not a legal advice. So as a last point related to GDPR, I would like to remind you the story of Alice and Bob, which is on the left-hand side of the slide, and quote one of the paragraphs from the GDPR. Article 9 of the GDPR is called processing of special categories of personal data. While things like ID, name, address, IP address, email, and so on are considered to be personal data, there are specific categories of personal data which require special treatment. And if you compare the questions that Alice and Bob wanted to ask with a list of things that GDPR treats as special categories of personal data, you will see significant amount of overlap, right? Ethnical origin, political and religious opinions, trade union membership, and sexual orientation. So in general, those sensitive elements, those special categories of personal data, should not be used unless one of the exceptional clauses applies. So yes, we can use this kind of information, we can study this kind of topics, but we need to be extra careful with them. Good. So now we know who will be interviewed. We have designed an appropriate informed consent form. This form has been signed, like we are almost there. But who will conduct an interview? So at the face value, this question seems trivial, right? Of course, the researcher should conduct the interview. I mean, who else? However, even in this situation, there are many options. One interviewer or two. One interviewer is easier to arrange. However, it is usually very difficult to ask questions and take notes at the same time. And an interviewer always takes notes, even in presence of audio or video recording. For example, because audio or video recording can only be consulted after the interview, while the notes can be consulted during the interview, and this can be those notes can be a source, a reason for an interviewer to ask additional questions, which is very, very common in semi-structured interviews. Two interviewers can, of course, notice different things and ask different questions. However, if we are talking about the classical setup of an interview where we have one interviewee, and in this case we'll have two interviewers, this might be intimidating. So we need to be careful with this. The interviewee should be feeling comfortable, of course. This means that if there are several researchers involved in the project, which is typically the case, the interviewee should be able to choose the interviewer. For example, the interviewer that happens to live in the same time zone where the interviewee is located. So I'm currently involved in a research study with a colleague from New Mexico. We, of course, live in very different time zones, and our interviewees can select which one of us they want to talk to. And the third concern that should be taken into account is the similarity between the interviewer and the interviewee. The similarity of previous experiences helps to establish trust and mutual understanding. For example, it is known that when talking about more social subjects, women are more likely to disclose more to a woman interviewer than to a man interviewer. So you might be considering, you might consider involving different interviewers in function of the target audience. What is a successful interviewer? So a successful interviewer should be, of course, knowledgeable. We talked about it in the beginning when we've been discussing the problem of lingo. So interviewers should understand what the interviewees are talking about. Pilot interview is actually a great way of becoming knowledgeable. At the same time, interviewers should not somehow dominate the interviewee. So interviewers should position themselves as a learner rather than as an expert. An interview should be structuring. So the purpose of the interview should be clear. The interviewer should ask whether the interviewee has questions. Interviewer should be summarizing as the interview goes. Once you heard something, you might be asking confirmatory questions. For instance, did I understand correctly that according to you, mentoring means this and that? Interview should be clear. So the questions should be simple, should be short, ideally easy to answer, and there should be no scientific jargon. So we are not going to talk to interviewees about what kind of research methods we are using, unless this is, of course, the focus of the interview. There is a high degree of sensitivity because, of course, it's not enough to listen to what is being said, but also how it's being said. An interviewer should be empathetic in dealing with the interviewee. Often how things are being said reveal more than what is actually being said. Interviewers should be ethically sensitive, and it's not only about GDPR or predefined ethical guidelines, but in general, interviewees should appreciate what there is, how their answer is going to be treated. An interviewer should be steering. So in a way, in particular for, I mean, of course, for unstructured interviews it's difficult, but for semi-structured and structured interviews, interviewers should know where it is going, because otherwise it might become just a coffee chat, which is a nice experience, but doesn't necessarily help. Interviewers should be critical. In a way, interviewers should be prepared to challenge what has been said. For example, and it really happens quite often, that the interviewees are inconsistent in their answers. So a critical interviewer would ask the interviewee to compare their opinions. For instance, how do you think A is related to B? Or how do you rhyme what you said before with what you are saying now? Remembering. So this is related to taking notes and essentially being able to relate what is said to what has been said before. Interpreting. This means that you have to clarify and extend meanings of interior statements without actually imposing on them, right? So what does it mean, for instance, for you to be successful as a software developer? What does it mean that your pull request has been treated unfairly? Balance is a tricky one. Balance is usually a balance of talking between interviewer and interviewee. So an interviewer should not be talking too much, because this can make the interviewee too passive, and doesn't talk too little, which is essentially meaning might lead to the interviewee feeling that they're not really talking along the right lines, right? I mean, if you are not providing the interviewee any kind of verbal or non-verbal feedback, they will be doubting whether they are giving right answers. And it doesn't matter whether you stress that there are no right answers in reality, because usually it's not an exam. people still are looking for some kind of confirmation, yes, you are doing well as the interview goes. Of course, you should be open. In particular, in semi-structured interviews, you will always find things you do not expect. So this means that you need to be respond to what is going on and to be flexible. And of course, adaptable, right? So it's very important because every person is different. And you have to adapt your interviewing style to the person you are talking to. So it's a whole bunch of things. Most of them are coming from social research methods by Alan Brinkman. But in fact, if you look at interviews, at good interviewers, not necessarily in a scientific context, you will recognize some of those elements. Of course, when you're looking at journalists, they might be critical and harsh because they don't necessarily think about the well-being of the persons they are being interviewing. At least not always. This is, of course, not the case for us. We need to be gentle and we need to be balance critics and humbleness. Okay, so I've been speaking about the balanced presentations. I've been talking quite for some time now. Then it's again for you. So here is a picture for one of the companies, and the question is this a good place for an interview? And I'm going to start the poll. So A, it's a good place for an interview. B, it's a bad place for an interview. So I see that 8 people say that it is a bad place for an interview, and 5 people say that it is a good place for an interview. It's actually a bad place for an interview. And there are 2 reasons. First of all, this is, you see the glass wall, right? So this means that every passerby will essentially see that a person is being interviewed. This is already breaching the confidentiality. Maybe people do not want it to be known that they are being interviewed. Maybe people can want to talk to each other. What are those interviewers asking about? Moreover, if you look carefully, you will see a copy machine outside of this meeting space. This copy machine can attract passers-by, and this will threaten the anonymity of the interviewee, even more. So it will be pretty obvious to colleagues that an interview has taken place, or even maybe they might conjecture what is essentially being talked about. So this is definitely not a good place for an interview because it does not provide the right protection of anonymity. So this is essentially not an interview, but it's a picture by Gabriele Münter and Vasily Kandinsky, which is representing a conversation between Kandinsky and another painter, Erma Bossi. So why have I chosen this picture? Because to me, this conversation has essentially several crucial elements of the interview. So please look at Erma's body language. So she is leaning forward. So she is essentially listening very actively to what Vasily has to tell. Presumably there is coffee at the table, and this can help in creating a more relaxed sphere. It seems to be a quiet space where there is essentially nobody else present, and this is extremely important for the interviews. One, because of the anonymity argument we already talked about. Two, because it can also ensure that there are no interruptions. And three, because the interviewee hopefully feels safe to disclose more information about the interview, about the topic of the interview, right? The only thing which is, of course, missing from this picture, because it's not a really interview but a conversation, is the recording. So when we are talking about the recording, it of course predominantly comes in two forms: audio and video. Notes, as I already mentioned, they are always being taken, but they are rarely being used as a sole recording mechanism. Note taken is usually combined with audio or video recording. So advantages and disadvantages. Audio is less intrusive than video. I had interviewees that agreed to be interviewed on audio, but not agreed to be interviewed on video. Some people are extremely conscious about their looks. And of course, given the current situation with remote work, or if you are interviewing people who are not physically located in the same space, audio might be preferred in case of poor internet connection. Video, simply because it allows you to see the face of the interviewee, it's a richer medium, so you can read non-verbal signals. It also becomes easier to interpret those signals. It also helps to establish trust, so this video works in both directions. It's not only you see them, they also see you. And it is usually beneficial because you prefer to talk to other people rather than to some kind of bodiless voices. So notes are meaningful as ways of capturing key insights and, as already mentioned, points which you would like to revisit later during the interview. So strictly speaking, you do not really need to take notes because you can hope to remember all this stuff. But of course, once you are busy with remembering things, you might be missing new things that the interviewee is providing you. So it makes a lot of sense to take notes during the interview, also to compare what is essentially being said compared to previous interviews. So, of course, the next question is, what are we going to do with those notes, audio and video recordings? Who will have access to this data? How this data will be protected? Will it be encrypted? Will it not be encrypted? Will it be stored in publicly available spaces or not? And so on and so forth. For example, I mean, it has lots of implications for what you're doing. So for instance, interviews we are conducting at the university can only be stored at platforms which are either owned by the university itself or by some kind of Dutch scientific consortium. So my interviews are, for instance, stored at Research Drive, and the transcripts are stored at the university GitLab. We need to be extremely careful with what kind of data is being stored and what can happen if somebody unauthorized gets access to this data. So now it seems that we finally know everything about our interviews. We have our questions, we have decided whom we want to talk to, we have decided who is going to conduct interviews, we have chosen space, we have chosen the recording method. Can we finally start? And the answer is no. It's not enough to think that it's not enough that the researcher thinks that they are doing the right thing. An independent body should assess the research plan, the research design, and approve it. So in case of an interview, this independent body should assess both the interview guide, so the research, the questions we want to ask, as well as the interview process, with all those questions like how many people, who are those people, what is the space, what is the recording mechanism, what is the data storage. And usually the body is this independent body, which is assessing this kind of design, is known as the ethics committee, or ethical review board, or institutional review board. So ERB, IRB are typical abbreviations. So ERB will typically look at potential harm that the research can induce. For instance, by asking questions that make people uncomfortable, by deceiving people, or by compromising their privacy. So at our university, there is a standard form which has to be filled in for every research study that involves human participants or personally identifiable data, and should be submitted before potential participants are approached to take part in your research study. So it's not only for the interviews, it's also for surveys, it's also for mining data from GitHub. The fact that this data on GitHub or Stack Overflow is publicly available is not an excuse for not obtaining this permission, simply because data on GitHub and Stack Overflow and any other platform of this kind has not been provided for your research purpose. People on GitHub are sharing their data to contribute to open source projects, and not to be interviewed about, for instance, their coding development practices. And an important point, you cannot start your study before you got an approval. And yes, it is annoying, because getting such an approval takes time, weeks, and in some cases months. And of course, as a researcher, you would like to start going today, right? The moment you are have designed your study, you want to be able to implement it. There are many examples of all kinds of ethical problems which can be incurred by inappropriate study designs. This is one of them. This is an actual paper, but for obvious reasons, I do not want to shame the authors. So what happened there is that there have been 22 students who have had a good night's sleep, and 23 students who have agreed to skip a night, essentially to not to sleep at all. Those students have been given a programming task, and then the researchers have compared correctness of the programming tasks. So essentially, in this way, the researchers have studied the impact of sleep deprivation on correctness of programming tasks in students. So the questions for you are, of course, how can this study harm participants? And what would you do to reduce the likelihood or the extent of this harm? So please type. How can this study harm participants? Sleep deprivation, yes. Well, somebody would argue this is just one night. You know, students don't want to be partying, so it's probably not the first night they are skipping. They will likely do more things after the programming task. For example, they will be driving to work after the task, and this can be dangerous. Right. That's exactly what I had in mind. So this is exactly my concern in this entire setup. Yeah, so falling asleep at the wheel is a very likely thing. And a way to mitigate this would be to offer a night's sleep next to the experiment. So essentially, in the experiment, in the vicinity of the experiment itself. Essentially, it is extremely important to understand that human beings are human beings. And it sounds very stupid and very trivial, but we cannot expect human beings to behave exactly as we want them to behave. Maybe we can easily say to students, you should not be driving, but if we do not provide them with a feasible alternative not to drive, they will drive, right? It's not the intention of ethical review boards to prohibit things, but rather to create awareness of potential harm research can cause, as well as the ways to limit this potential harm. Summarizing the discussion of the interviews. We need to start with informal questions. It's usually a good question to ask open questions to elicit things, and then to summarize observations, summarize what we hear, to confirm understanding, and then finally to probe, to go deeper. Ask for examples. Examples make any kind of discussion tangible. Compare and contrast. Sometimes answers are inconsistent, as I already said. Sometimes they are inconsistent with previous interviews, sometimes within the interview. Is there anything you would like to add on top of all the questions you've been asking? And finally, do you have questions for me? In a recent study, I have found that this is essentially a very, very valuable way of asking questions. So do you have questions for me? Because this essentially allows interviewees to provide their perspective, not only on specific questions you've been asking, but on the entire topic you've been discussing. Maybe this topic doesn't seem relevant for them, or maybe they have completely different perspectives on what is essentially going on. So the product of an interview is, of course, an audio or a video recording. But for the following step of the analysis, which we are not going to discuss today, but we will have a guest lecture on them, we need text. We need text because, for example, we want to see whether several interviewees discuss the same problem. We want to see what kind of language they use to discuss this problem. We want to see how often do they mention it. So a logical next step is transcription. So this is an ancient Egyptian scribe who was writing things that people have been telling him. It did not change that dramatically since ancient Egypt. So if you're thinking about manual transcription and verbatim transcription, this is usually a very slow process. Experienced scribes can do it roughly in 4 times. So if you have 1 hour interview, then it will take 4 hours for an experienced transcriber to write it down. For novices, it usually takes up to 10 times. For students, of course, we can always involve students to support this kind of tasks, but students have to be trained. And in particular, students would be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which is not always easy. An alternative would be to do a manual chunked transcription, when essentially you are not transcribing everything verbatim, but you are only listening and trying to write down one core idea for 30 up to 30 seconds, essentially listening for a very small fragment and writing down the core fragment. If you have money, you can pay for 1 hour transcription. An advantage of the thing is that this kind of services exist online, and this kind of services exist for many different languages. Usually 1 hour of transcription costs between 15 and 20 euro. There are, of course, also ways of semi-automatic transcription, for instance, auto-generated captions. But this is not always obvious, partly because of the quality of those captions, partly because captions and transcriptions are not exactly the same, and finally because people have somebody can be, somebody might have cold, somebody might have an accent, and so on and so on. And this is always requiring manual correction. This is also the necessary effort. You can always talk to Nathan about his recent experiences with this kind of correction of auto-generated captions. One of the last topics we want to discuss is, of course, how to deal with this transcription, because the transcription is often not limited to a literal recording of what the interviewee has said, but also involves removing some parts which can lead to identification of the interviewees. Again, it's all about protecting anonymity and privacy of the interviewees and disclosing only as little as really necessary. There are two questions here, right? Like what to anonymize and how to anonymize. What is very easy to answer in generic terms, like everything which can lead to identification of a person, but it's not always clear what it can be. So for instance, a combination of a company name or an open source project name with a role such as developer or tester and experience and gender can be already enough to de-anonymize people. I mean, at the same time, for reporting gender, for instance, is usually being seen as a good practice, since it shows that researchers did not merely study the majority group, and indeed gender might affect variables of interest when it comes to social aspects or things like program comprehension. The how question is usually more tricky. The most common strategy is just to give people numbers like P1, P2, P35. This is to a large extent allows one to anonymize as much as possible. However, it also hides information that might be useful. So for instance, if you want to interview people working with different programming languages, you might like to preserve information what kind of people are saying this. So for instance, JS4 would mean JavaScript developer number 4, and P2.3 would, for instance, mean the third interviewee in team number 2. So if we're working with subgroups on the of the population, we might consider preserving this kind of subgrouping structure. We can also consider giving pseudonyms. So for instance, if we want to preserve more personal information, so if we want to stress that the person we talk to is a Chinese software developer, we might give them a pseudonym way, independently from what their name actually was. So all those techniques, of course, assumes that every participant has a pseudonym and that the pseudonym is unique. But you can, even this is not necessarily the case. So there are approaches, for instance, by Saunders that suggest multiple pseudonyms for the same person, which would, of course, provide an extra protection of interviewees in terms of de-anonymization. You can also swap it, right? You can also combine two people into one pseudonym if your goal is to create a more representational story. But again, how far can you go with this kind of data manipulation? When it comes to storing data, of course, we need to clearly separate personally identifiable information from the recordings, such that if our storage gets stolen, privacy of participants is not affected. And finally, the last step of data collection process in interviewing is confirmation. All kinds of things we are doing are interpretive in nature. What is relevant, what is not relevant, what is should be anonymized, what should not be anonymized, did we understand the interview correctly, what you did not understand the interview correctly. So essentially, ideally, we would like to check with the interviewees that we did not introduce any mistakes during this entire elaborate process, from transcription through anonymization and so on. This kind of interview correspondence, this is element G on the slide we are going to see in a moment, will suggest that participants can elaborate on some topics or delete some of the information they have provided. Again, comfort and safety of the interview is crucial. So if for whatever reasons they decide to remove parts of what they said, you have no way of preventing them. So a small anecdote, in one of the sociological studies I have recently read, one of the interviewees has insisted that his interview will have his real name rather than a pseudonym, so, as was suggested by the researcher. So the interviewer has explained the risk associated with this decision, and once the interviewer has confirmed that he has understood them, ultimately the publication included the real name of this interviewee, because for this interview it was extremely important for them to be named and to have the name associated with what they've been saying. So to summarize what we have been discussing today, we talked about interviews. Interviews can be used both for explanatory and for exploratory purposes, both to explore domain, to understand the phenomenon we do not understand, and to explain observations we have performed before. Interviews require very careful preparation since we cannot just redo them. So as much as possible should be done right. When it comes to the interview questions, they should be derived from the research questions, checked and double-checked on whether they reflect what we want to know, whether they're not leading, whether they're clear to prospective interviewees thinking about piloting, and whether indeed they do not make them uncomfortable. Don't forget that interview is not merely a collection of questions, but an entire process, ranging from who is interviewing, who is being interviewed, in what environment does an interview take place, and how data is being collected and processed. This entire thing, so both the questions and the process, have to be approved by the Ethical Review Board and should comply with GDPR. Moreover, this process doesn't even stop after the interview has been conducted, because then additional things should be kept in mind, which are related to transcription, to anonymization and of the interviews, and confirmation of the information obtained. This concludes this lecture. I would like to thank you for your attention. What is going to happen next week? We are going to have 2 lectures. On Tuesday, we are going to talk about surveys. Surveys are similar to interview in a sense that they are also all about talking to people and about asking questions. So quite some elements of the interview discussion we had today will be relevant for surveys, but surveys are very different because they typically allow us to go much broader than with interviews. Instead of talking about 20, 30 people, we might be talking about 18 people, 100 people, in exceptional cases, a couple of thousands of people. Numbers which we, of course, cannot reach through interviews. On Thursday, we will have our first guest lecture. Dr. Eleni Constantinou will talk about mining software repositories. Mining software repositories is similar to surveys in a sense that we are trying to get as many voices, to hear as many voices as possible. This is a classical element of a sample study design. But voices in this case are not coming by talking to people, but by analyzing repository data, such as repositories on GitHub, posts on Stack Overflow, or messages on Twitter. Thank you very much for this, for your attention, and this concludes our lecture.